Marvin Gets on the Air, an AI-assisted audible story based on the real-life experiences of real-life persons by Brad Tuttle.
By the time Marvin reached 92 years of age, he had become convinced that the world was much more interesting than most people realized. The problem, in his opinion, was that everyone spent too much time talking and not enough time listening. The discovery began with an online classified advertisement. Estate sale, police scanner, works, $20. When the husband dies, the widow is keen to unload the dumb stuff her husband collected over the years. This widowed seller included only a blurry photograph, and the scanner looked as though it had survived 3 presidential administrations, several moves, and at least one flooded basement. To Marvin, that wasn't a warning. It was evidence that the radio had already proved itself. He offered $10. She would have sold it for $5. The scanner soon occupied a place of honor beside Marvin's recliner at the shady rest apartments. Its antenna, a straightened-out paperclip, leaned slightly to one side. Several buttons had long since lost their labels, and there was no owner's manual. None of that bothered Marvin. Half the fun of acquiring something new was figuring out how it worked. For the next several evenings, he pushed every button he could find. Sometimes the display flashed mysterious numbers. Sometimes it beeped. Sometimes it stopped on weather reports from neighboring counties. Once it landed on a conversation between 2 truck drivers, debating the merits of red versus mustard-based barbecue. Marvin wasn't sure whether they ever reached a conclusion, but he found himself rooting for the red version. Eventually, almost by accident, he discovered the local police, fire, and emergency unencrypted frequencies. The apartment suddenly became much quieter, at least on Marvin's end. He spent hours listening to the crisp, efficient exchanges between dispatchers and first responders. Every transmission was brief and purposeful. There were no wasted words, no unnecessary explanations, and no dramatic speeches. A few words, a location, and everyone involved seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. Within a week, Marvin had learned the rhythm of the town. Morning traffic produced stalled cars and minor fender benders. Friday evenings generated an astonishing number of residential complaints. Summer thunderstorms kept the fire department busy with downed trees, flooded roads, and the occasional lightning strike. Without ever leaving his apartment, Marvin felt as though he had a front row seat to the life of the entire community. His favorite frequencies, however, belonged to the small municipal airport a few miles outside town. The pilot spoke a language that sounded suspiciously like English, but contained enough numbers, abbreviations, and unfamiliar phrases to keep Marvin guessing for weeks. He understood only a fraction of what he heard, but that merely increased his curiosity. He resurrected an old spiral notebook and began recording everything that seemed important. That was pretty much everything. Times, frequencies, weather conditions, unusual phrases, and questions all found their way onto the pages. One page contained nothing but question marks surrounding the phrase left downwind. Another was devoted entirely to the purpose of a windsock. Although Marvin had once flown with a friend in his small plane, he had no intention of becoming a pilot at his age. That was a task that required passing a test. Marvin didn't want to take a test. He just enjoyed eavesdropping in on other people's conversations. His neighbor Earl occasionally wandered into the apartment and found Marvin listening intently to the scanner. At first, Earl couldn't understand why anyone would spend hours hearing other people work, but before long he found himself pulling up a chair and listening too. The 2 men discovered that every day produced a new collection of mysteries, surprises, and stories, all unfolding over the airwaves, interspersed with long periods of static-infused silence. By early December, Marvin had become remarkably proficient with his $10 scanner. He could search frequencies, organize memory channels, and adjust the squelch all this without the aid of the non-existent manual. He was especially fond of explaining that squelch was one of radio's greatest inventions, although few of his neighbors had the slightest idea what he was talking about. Christmas arrived quietly at Shady Rest. The community room filled with decorations that had almost certainly served several generations of residents. Hot chocolate brewed throughout the day, cookies appeared from every direction, and an elderly upright piano struggled heroically through familiar Christmas carols. Among Marvin's gifts was a long, rectangular package. Inside were 2 brand-new Baofeng GMRS Pro handheld radios, each fitted with the standard rubber ducky, plus an unusually long, flexible tactical antenna. Compared with his old scanner, they looked surprisingly modern. The instruction manual was thick enough to qualify as bedtime reading, which Marvin considered an encouraging sign. His enthusiasm only lasted until he reached the second page. An FCC license is required before transmitting. The license did not require a test, only an application and fee. Marvin assumed obtaining a license would be little more than filling out a simple form. Instead, he found himself navigating account registrations, email verifications, passwords with complicated requirements, security questions, and enough clunky, unfamiliar government websites to make him wonder what on earth had he gotten himself into. Fortunately, persistence had always been one of Marvin's stronger qualities. Several days later, an email from the Federal Communications Commission informed him that he was officially licensed to operate on the General Mobile Radio Service. Along with the license came a call sign, WRKH727. Marvin immediately developed a memory trick. WRKH stood for workhorse, and 727 a Boeing 727. That is the workhorse of modern aviation after propeller planes fell into disuse. WRKH 727. The phrase lodged itself firmly in his memory, and before long he could recite his call sign without ever looking at the license. He printed several copies anyway, laminated one for safekeeping, and tucked another into the radio's carrying case. Government paperwork, in Marvin's experience, had an uncanny ability to disappear just when someone wanted to see it. Naturally, Marvin gave one of the radios to Earl. There was only one small complication. Earl needed his own FCC license before he could legally transmit. Marvin was now experienced enough to guide him through the online application process, although guide might be too generous a description. The two men spent an afternoon puzzling through the FCC website together, occasionally congratulating themselves when a page loaded exactly as expected. When Earl's license finally arrived, the two friends celebrated as though they had both graduated from college. The radios were programmed with the same GMRS channels, their batteries fully charged, and the tactical antennas carefully installed. The owner's manual recommended beginning with short-range testing, advice Marvin took seriously. Earl stood at one end of Marvin's living room. Marvin sat in his chair, both radios tuned to channel 19. Marvin read from his prepared script. "This is Whiskey Romeo Kilo Hotel, 727. Can you hear me? Hey, Earl, can you hear me? Earl, you only press the PTT button to talk. Let go of the button to listen. Earl, let go of the button." Once the proper protocol was established, the second communication that the two men attempted reached opposite ends of the building, using cell phones to communicate ready, set, go instructions without the radio. Soon Earl went to the parking lot, followed by the grocery store across the street, and then a nearby city park. Every successful contact encouraged the duo to try another location the following day. Before long, the experiments developed a predictable routine. Each afternoon, weather permitting, Marvin and Earl climbed aboard their well-traveled mobility scooters, clipped their radios securely to their belts, and headed off in opposite directions. One would remain near the apartments, while the other ventured a little farther away. If the radios worked clearly, they simply increased the distance the next day. Neither man considered himself conducting scientific research, but that was exactly what they were doing. Without realizing it, the two retirees had begun a systematic exploration of just how far a pair of inexpensive handheld radios could communicate. It was a race to see which could go further, the radios or the batteries in the mobility scooters.